mind just bringing this over? Okay. Setting. The cabins of the physicists were located on the fourth deck. He could find his way around now on the Eurydice. He had studied the layout of the ship, so different from the ones he had flown. He did not know the names or purposes of many of the machines in the sternmost section, which was unoccupied and cut off from the rest of the hull by triple bulkheads. The grub Leviathan was crisscrossed with connecting tunnels like a secret network through an elongated cylindrical city. In his muscles was the memory of moving down narrow corridors, either oval in cross-section or circular like a well, where you floated weightless, here and there pushing lightly to change direction on the turns, but in freighters you could reach the hold more simply via the ventilation shaft. All you had to do was turn on the air compressor and be carried in the roar of a strong wind, your legs dangling uselessly like vestigial organs. He found himself missing weightlessness, which he had cursed so many times when making repairs because Newton's laws kept reminding one of their existence. If he used a hammer without gripping something well with the other hand, he would end up doing cartwheels that were entertaining only to spectators. The elevators, actually wheelless oval cars with windows so curved that one saw one's own reflection in them, distorted and reduced, moved without a sound, giving the numbers of the sections past him blinking at the right stop. The corridor had a rough yet deep carpeting. Around a corner disappeared a vacuum cleaner, looking like a turtle with wands, while he walked past a row of doors that bulged slightly as the wall did, and that had high thresholds with brass fittings, no doubt to satisfy the whim of some interior decorator. It was hard to think of any other reason. He stood before Logger's cabin, suddenly unsure of himself. He was still unable to become one with the crew. Their friendliness at meals, the way one group and then another invited him to their table, seemed forced to him, as if they were trying to pretend that he was really one of them, and that his lack of an assignment was only temporary. True, he had talked with Logger, and Logger had assured him that he could drop in whenever he wished, but this, instead of giving him confidence, somehow put him on his guard. Logger was not just anyone. He was the number one physicist, and not merely on the Eurydice. He had never thought that he could be assailed with doubts about how to act with someone. Social grace was as out of place here as a parlor game in the vaults of the Great Pyramid. The door had no handle, a touch with the tips of the fingers, and it opened, so quickly that he almost drew back, like a savage before an automobile. A spacious room. He was struck by its disorder. Among heaps of tapes, photographic plates, papers, and atlases stood a large desk, its top curved around in a half-ring with a swivel chair in the center. Behind it, on the wall, was a rectangle of black with moving dots of light. On either side of this flickering control panel hung large photographs, lit-up transparencies of spiral nebulas, and farther on were vertical, pillar-like cylinders partly opened, full of pigeonholes for computer disks. In the left corner stood a huge rhomboid machine with a chair attached to the base. The thing went up through the ceiling, and from a shot under the binocular eyepiece emerged a tape, in small jumps bearing some kind of graph. The tape collected in coils on the floor, and was covered by an old Persian rug with a worn hieroglyphic pattern. It was the rug that amazed him. A cylinder column vanished, revealing an entrance to an adjoining room. Logger was standing there, in living trousers and a sweater, with a head of overgrown hair, and gave him a smile. There was both understanding and innocent. The face was fleshy, as of a child aged before its time, no more resembling the face of a creator of high abstractions than did Einstein's in the days when Einstein still worked in a government office. "Hello," said the visitor. "Enter, colleague, enter. It's good you came. At one blow you can delve into physics and metaphysics," he added in explanation. "Father Arago is with me." The visitor followed Logger into the other cabin, which was smaller, with a covered bunk and several chairs around a table, at which the Dominican was examining a diagram through a magnifying glass. Or perhaps it was the computerized map of a planet, having the lines of latitude across it. Arago pulled out a chair near him. The three sat down. "This is Mark. You know him, Father?" The Logger, and before he could reply, went on, I can guess your problem, Mark. It's hard to have a man-to-man talk with a machine. The machine is not to blame, observed the Dominican, irony in his voice. It says what was put into it. That is what you put into it, the physicist corrected him with the smile of an opponent. The theories don't agree. Not that they ever did. We are talking, Mark, about the fate of civilizations above the window, he explained to the visitor, but since you came in the middle of the argument, let me summarize the beginning for you. You're aware that the old notions about ETI have changed. Even if there are a million civilizations in the galaxy, their duration is so dispersed in time that it is impossible first to communicate with the host of a planet and then drop in on him. Civilizations are harder to catch than a mayfly that lives for one day. We look for pupas, therefore, and not the adults. Do you know what the window of contact is? Yes. All right, then. Having sifted through 200 million stars, we came up with 11 million candidates. The majority have lifeless planets or planets below the window or planets above the window. Imagine, he clapped him on the knee, that you have fallen in love with the portrait of a 16-year-old girl. You set out to woo her. Unfortunately, the journey will take 50 years. You find an old woman or a grave. If you decide to declare your love by mail, you'll be an old man yourself before you receive the first reply. And that, in a nutshell, is the basic idea of CETI. You can't hold a conversation at intervals of many centuries. So we're traveling to a pupa? Asked Mark. For a while now, people called him that, but suddenly the thought occurred to him, he didn't know why, that the idea might have come from the monk, who, like himself, both was and was not a member of the crew. We don't know what we're traveling to, remarked Arago. Logger seemed pleased by these words. Quite. Life-producing planets are recognized by the composition of their atmospheres. The catalog of these in our galaxy runs into the thousands. We've screened them all and have about 30 that offer hope. Of intelligence? Intelligence in diapers is invisible, and when it matures, out of the window it flies. We have to pounce on it earlier. How do we know that our destination is worth the trouble? It's Quinta, the 5th planet of the Zeta Harpiae. We have a lot of data. In dubio pro reo, said the Dominican. And who, Father, in your opinion, is the defendant? Logger asked, but again did not let him answer, continuing, the first cosmic symptom of intelligence is radio. Well, before radio astronomy, actually not that much before, about 100 years. A planet with transmitters can be detected where their combined power goes into the gigawatts. Quinta emits in the high and ultra-high ranges less than its sum. But a phenomenal amount of for a lifeless planet. For a planet with electronics, a moderate amount, since it lies below the level of solar noise, but something is in there. In radio, below the threshold, we have evidence. Circumstantial, the apostolic delegate corrected him again. True in only one piece, agreed Logger, but more important, there have been observed on Quinta point bursts of electromagnetism, one of which was recorded, the whole emission, by a spectroscope from orbiters near Mars. Those 2 orbiters cost Earth a bundle. Our expedition. Atomic bombs? Asked the man who resigned the name to Mark. No, rather the preliminaries to planetary engineering. Because these were clean thermonuclears. Had things on Quinta taken the course they did on Earth, it would have started with the Uranides. What's more, the bursts appeared only within the polar circle, that is, on their Arctica or Antarctica. One could melt a continental glacier in this way, but that is not the point on which we differ. He glanced at the Dominican. The question is whether or not our arrival will cause harm there. Father Arago believes it might. I am of the same opinion. Then what is the disagreement? I believe that the game is worth the candle. The exploration of a world without causing harm is impossible. Mark began to understand the gist of the debate. He forgot his own situation. The old fire returned to him. You, that is, Father, are traveling with us against your convictions? He addressed the monk. Of course, said Arago. The church was among the opponents to the expedition. So-called contact could turn out to be the gift of a Trojan horse. Timeo Danaos et Dona Ferentes, a Pandora's box. So you have become affected, Father, by the mythological patronage of the project, laughed Logger. Eurydice, Hermes, Jupiter, Hades, Cerberus. We plundered the Greeks. The ship actually ought to have been named Argo, with us as the psychonauts, but we'll try to cause as little harm as possible. That's why the plan of the operation is so complex. Contra spin spero, sighed the monk. Or rather, he added, I wish to be in error. Lager seemed not to hear, taken with another thought. When we reach Quinta, at least 300 years will have passed there for our 1 year of ship's time, which means that we will be catching them in the upper region of the window, if only not later. A difference of seconds in our maneuvers could hasten or delay us tremendously. As for harm, the Reverend Father knows that a technological civilization has inertia, though it is not stationary. I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm laughing. In other words, it's not that easy to throw off its course. Whatever happens, we will not be in the role of gods descending from heaven. We did not seek out primitive cultures, and there is no astroethnologists in CETI. Arago, silent, regarded the physicist with narrowed eyes. The listener to this conversation ventured a question. But does it make sense? Does what make sense? Lager was surprised. To treat the ones who are unobservable as if they did not exist. It may be practical, but you could call it opportunism, too. If you wanted, replied Lager coldly. We chose a task that was possible to perform. The window of contact has empirical frame, but there is ethical justification for it as well. We won't be anointing the heads of the cave dwellers with oil distilled by the 22nd century. But enough of this pluralis majesticus. I stood by the project, and I'm here because for me contact means an exchange of knowledge, an exchange, not a patronage, not a dispensing of melioristic advice. And what if evil reigns there? Asked Arago. Does there exist a universal evil, a constant of evil? Countered Lager. I fear there does. Then we would have to say non possumus and chuck the project. I am only doing my duty. With these words, the monk rose, nodded to them, and departed. Lager, sprawled in his chair, made a face, moved his lips as if there was a bad taste in his mouth, then sighed. I respect the man because he can rile me. He tacks wings onto everything, or horns. But enough, that's not the reason I wanted to see you. We'll be sending a scout ship to Quinta. A single hull, able to land, the Hermes. It will fly 9 or 10 men. The captain and 4 have been decided on. The rest will be chosen by specialty in a ballot. Would you like to be on the ballot? At first Mark did not understand. To set foot there he burned. Disbelief, joy. Lager, seeing how the man lit up, hastened to add, getting on the ballot doesn't necessarily mean you're going. Scientific achievement isn't a guarantee either. The greatest theoretician could easily go to pieces. We need hard people, the kind that nothing will break. Gerbert is a brilliant psychologist, an expert on minds, but courage isn't tested in the laboratory. Do you know who you are? He paled. No. Then I'll tell you. On the Burnham Glacier, a number of people in walking machines died. Geyser eruptions took them by surprise. These were professional operators carrying out the instructions given them, and they had no idea that they were going to their death. 2 men went in search of them voluntarily. You are one of those 2. How can you know this? Dr. Gerbert told me that Dr. Gerbert and his assistant are ship physicians. They know their medicine, but are weak when it comes to computers. They decided to preserve medical confidentiality since it proved impossible to establish the identity of the man resurrected. Psychic trauma, they argued. There's no eavesdropping on the Eurydice. But there is a center with non-erasable non-erasable memory. The commander has access to it, the head informationist, and I. You won't tell the doctors, I hope? No. I didn't think you would. It would be doing them wrong. But won't they guess if, I doubt it, the doctors have to monitor constantly the state of health of our entire crew? And the voting is secret, the council votes. And the voting is secret, the council votes. Of Out of 5 votes, you should get 3, that's my guess. And I'm telling you this now because you have a heck of a lot of work ahead of you. I know that on the simulators you showed an astrogational ability, but in obsolete categories, first class for those times, not for today. You have a year to learn your interstellar ABCs. If you can handle that, you'll see the Quintons. And now go, I have a pile of things to catch up on. They rose. Mark was taller than the famous physicist and younger. He won't be going, he thought. Logger walked him to the door. But Mark did not notice this, did not see the darting lights on the black screen, did not remember if he said goodbye or even if he said anything, or how he got back to his cabin. He did not know what to do with himself. Going to the closet, he opened the wrong door by mistake, saw his face in the mirror, and murmured, "You'll see the Quintons." So he began his studies. The result of the statistical calculations was, all in all, clear. Life arose and endured on planets for billions of years, but throughout the time it was mute. Civilizations sprang from it not to perish but to transform themselves into something extra natural, because the birth rate of technologies in an ordinary spiral galaxy was a constant. They came into being, matured, and disappeared with the same frequency. New ones were continually emerging, and they escaped from the interval of mutual understanding, the window of contact before it was possible to exchange signals with them. The muteness of those existing primitively was obvious, but endless hypotheses were devoted to the silence of the highly developed. There was a whole library on the subject which he avoided for the time being. In one book he read, "At this moment for this century, astronomically the same thing, it can be concluded that Earth is the only civilization already technological and still biological throughout the length, breadth, and depth of the Milky Way," which seemed to lay to rest the plans of the CETI. 150 years went by before it turned out that this was not the case. Okay, so the next page was. The conquering of the space separating star from star so that some living intelligences could meet others in return was not accomplishable by simple flight, even if the astronauts traveled at speeds approaching light. They would neither meet those to whom they were going, nor see again those who remained behind on Earth at both destination and origin. Many centuries would pass in the few years of ship time. This categorical declaration of science prompted the Church to reflect theoretically as follows: He who created the world made the meeting of creatures from different stars an idle dream. He raised between them a barrier completely empty and invisible, yet impossible to break. An abyss that he could cross, not man. Human history, however, invariably went in directions that were not predicted. The abyss of space turned out indeed to be a barrier that could not be broken, but it could be sidestepped through a series of special maneuvers. The median time of the galaxy was one value. The galaxy itself was a clock that indicated the hour of its age. But in places of the greatest intensity of gravitation, galactic time underwent violent changes. There were boundaries at which it stopped altogether. These were the Schwarzschild spheres, the black surfaces of collapsed stars, event horizons, an object approaching such a horizon would begin to stretch in the eyes of a distant observer. It would disappear before touching the surface of the black hole because time, dilated by gravitation, displaced light toward the infrared and then to longer and longer wavelengths until finally not one reflected photon returned to the eye of the watcher. The black hole trapped within its horizon every particle and every scrap of light forever. In any case, a traveler approaching a black hole would be pulled apart along with his ship by the growing gravitation. Tidal forces there would lengthen any material object to a thread, and from the accretion disk formed around the black sphere the thread would go into a nose dive from which there was no return. Flybys past the collapsar star were impossible along any trajectory. The tidal forces would kill the travelers and rip their ship to pieces. The ship would be the densest cosmic dwarf, a neutron star, a globe of atomic nuclei, packed together into a solid compared with which the hardest steel would be as attenuated as a gas. It would make no difference. Even such a globe of the collapsar would pull out into a spindle shape and would tear and swallow it in an instant, leaving behind only the death throe flares of X-rays escaping into space. Collapsars that arose from stars a few times heavier than the sun were thus like sudden guillotines to wayfarers. If, however, the mass of a black hole was 100 or 1,000 times that of the Sun, the gravitation at its horizon could be as weak as Earth's. No immediate danger would threaten the ship that ventured there, and the crew moving toward such a horizon could completely fail to notice it. But they would never be able to emerge from beneath that unseen shell. A ship drawn into a giant collapsar would be annihilated, plummeting to the center in a matter of days or hours depending on the massiveness of the track. The astrophysics at the close of the 20th century drew such theoretical models of gravitational graveyards. But as usually happened in the history of knowledge, the models proved insufficient. The reality was more complex. First, quantum mechanics had to be taken into account. Every black hole gave off radiation. The larger the black hole, the weaker the radiation. Giant black holes, usually found at the centers of galaxies, would also eventually die, though their quantum evaporation might take 100 billion years. They would be the final relics of the former stellar splendor of the universe. Further diversification of black holes was discovered by subsequent calculation and simulation. A star, when it collapsed, its weakened centrifugal radiation, no longer able to counteract its gravity, did not immediately assume the shape of a sphere. It oscillated like a drop alternately flattened to a disk and then pulled into a cigar shape. This vibration was very brief, the frequency depending on the mass. The collapsar behaved like a gong that struck itself, but a gong at rest could be made to vibrate by a blow. A black sphere similarly could be set to oscillating again by sidereal engineering. One had to know the method and possess sufficient power on the order of 10 to the 44th power ergs, which would be beamed in such a way as to put the sphere in resonance. But for what purpose? To create what the astrophysicists acquainted with the giant casually called a temporal onion. Just as the center of an onion was surrounded by layers of tissue visible in cross sections like the rings of a tree, so a collapsar in resonance was surrounded by gravitationally curved time, or rather by a complex stratification of space-time. To a distant observer, a black hole appeared to vibrate, like a tuning fork of several seconds, but for one who found himself in its vicinity, on a contour line of altered time, the readings of the galactic clock lost all meanings. Thus, if a ship came upon a black hole that warped the continuum multivalently along a gradient, the ship could enter a bradychronality and remain for years in that zone in retarded time before leaving the temporal port. To the eyes of the outside observer, the ship would vanish upon reaching the black hole, and after its invisible stop in the bradychronality, emerge in their nearby space. For the entire galaxy, for everyone watching the resonating collapsar from a distance, it would seem to oscillate in seconds between disk and cigar, exactly as it had oscillated in its violent birth when it was a star collapsed by gravity after the nuclear furnace went out. Whereas to the ship on the bradychronality, time could come almost to a halt. But this was not all. The collapsar, vibrating, behaved not like a perfectly elastic ball, but rather like a non-uniformly distorting balloon on a bounce due to the magnification of relativistic effects. Thus, with the bradychronalities, retrochronalities could appear, currents or rivers of time flowing backward. For distant observers, Neither one nor the other existed. To make use of these retardations or reversals of time, therefore, one had to enter them physically. The project planned to use the solitary collapsar above the constellation Happy as a port for the Eurydice. The mission of the expedition was not to establish contact with just any civilization that lay within the interval of possible communication, but to catch a civilization that, like a skyward butterfly pursued by an entomologist, was on its way out of the window, already fluttering at the upper edge. Indispensable for this operation was a parking place in time, at a distance from the inhabited planet, which would allow the human psychonauts to visit it before the civilization departed from Ortega and Nelson's main road of development. To this end, the expedition was divided into 3 stages. In the first, the Eurydice would proceed to the Collapsar in the constellation Harpy, chosen as a place for concealment and temporal maneuvers. The Collapsar was named appropriately Hades, because the Eurydice would be preceded by an unmanned Colossus, a missile to be used only once, the Orpheus. It was a gravity gun, a Gracer, gravity amplification by collimated excitation, a resonance. At a signal from the Eurydice, it would set the black hole oscillating according to the latter's own natural frequency and amplitude. Although gigantic on the scale of Earth's objects, the Orpheus was tiniest speck compared with the mass of the collapsar it was to set in motion, but it could accomplish this through the phenomenon of gravitational resonance. Giving up its vibratory ghost to Hades, it would thereby induce in the collapsar a single contraction and dilation, whereupon that black hell, opening its abysses, would permit the Eurydice to enter and ride the vortex of bradycoronal currents. But first it was necessary to verify from the ship that the 5 light-year distant Quinta was in the prime of its technological era. But first it was necessary to verify from the ship that the 5 light-year distant Quinta was in the prime of its technological era, and to determine from that diagnosis the right moment to visit it. Having fixed the moment, the Eurydice would then make a temporal harbor for herself in Hades, which would now be in vibration from the Gracer emission of the Orpheus. As the Orpheus had enough power for only one discharge of coherent gravity, annihilating itself in that discharge, the operation could not be repeated. If it did not succeed the first time because of a navigational error in the temporal storm, an incorrect diagnosis of the rate of development in the Quintan civilization, or any other factor not taken into account, the expedition would be a fiasco, which meant, in the best case, returning to Earth empty-handed. The plan was further complicated by the decision to make use, within the hell of Hades, of retrochronalities, of time flowing in reverse of the time of the entire galaxy, so that the expedition could return to the vicinity of the Sun less than 20 years after takeoff, even though 1,000 parsecs separated the Harpy from Earth. The exact date of return, of course, was indeterminate. A fraction of a second in the navigation through Brady and retrochronalities made a difference of years far from the presses and grinding mills of gravitation. His mind could not accept these statements. They were fraught with paradox. The main paradox was as follows. The Eurydice was to remain above the collapsar in non-time, or in a time different from the ordinary. The reconnaisseurs would fly to Quinta and return. This would take more than 70,000 hours, or roughly 8 years. From the blow of the Gracer, the collapsar was supposed to oscillate between a flattened disk and an elongated spindle for only a moment or two to all distant observers. When the reconnaisseurs returned, therefore, they would not find the ship in its collapsar harbor. The black hole would long before this have resumed the shape of a non-vibrating sphere, and yet the Hermes, leaving Quinta, was to find the mothership in the temporal port, even though the port, having come into existence only to disappear immediately, would surely not be there when the Hermes got back. How could one thing be reconciled with the other? There are physicists, Logger explained, who claim to understand this the same way they understand what stones in cupboards are. What they understand, in fact, is only that a theory agrees with the experimental results, with its measurements. Physics, my friend, is a narrow path drawn across a gulf that the human imagination cannot grasp. It is a set of answers to certain questions that we put to the world, and the world supplies the answers on the condition that we will not ask it other questions, questions shouted out by common sense, and common sense? It is which is understood by an intelligence using senses no different from those of a baboon. Such an intelligence wishes to know the world in terms that apply to its terrestrial biological niche, but the world outside that niche, that incubator of sapient apes, has properties that one cannot take in hand, see, sniff, gnaw, listen to, and in this way appropriate. For the Eurydice and her collapsar port, the flight of the Hermes will take a couple of weeks. For the crew of the Hermes, the flight will take 1.5 years, more or less. That's 3 months to Quinta, a year on Quinta, and 3 months back. For observers located neither on the Hermes nor in the Eurydice, the Hermes will complete its mission in 9 years, while the Eurydice will disappear from sight for the same amount of time. According to the time measured on board the mothership, she will pass from Friday to Saturday, return to Friday, and then the collapsar will spit her out into space. Time will flow more slowly on the Hermes than on Earth because of its near light speed. On the Eurydice, time, gravitationally dilated, will flow even more slowly, and then in reverse she will descend from a bradychronality to a retrochronality, and from there jump to a galactochronal line. Emerging, she'll rendezvous with the Hermes in an unfolded space-time continuum. If the Eurydice miscalculates by seconds navigating the variochronalities, she will not rendezvous with the Hermes. There is no contradiction in this, so to speak, on the world's part. The contradictions arise from the disparity between a mind born in the negligible gravity of Earth and phenomena pertaining to gravities trillions of times greater. It is that simple. The world is ordered according to universal rules called laws of nature, but the same rule may manifest itself differently at different intensities. I almost read that as intestines. Take, for example, a man falling into a black hole. For him, space takes on the aspect of time because he is no longer able to retreat in it, just as you cannot step backward in terrestrial time, that is, into the past. It is impossible to imagine what such a fall would be like. Assuming, of course, that one didn't perish immediately beneath the event horizon, I still believe that the world is arranged in our favor. Since we can nevertheless gain mastery over things that run counter to our senses. Consider, a child masters a language without understanding the principles of its grammar, its syntax, or the internal contradictions of speech that are hidden from the speakers. You've got me philosophizing. I don't know why I would trip over that. You've got me philosophizing now. A man craves ultimate truths. Every mortal mind, I think, is that way. But what is ultimate truth? It's the end of the road, where there is no more mystery, no more hope, and no more questions to ask since all the answers have been given. But there is no such place. The universe is a labyrinth made of labyrinths. Each leads to another, and wherever we cannot go ourselves, we reach with mathematics. Out of mathematics, we build wagons to carry us into the non-human realms of the world. It is also possible to construct, out of mathematics, worlds outside the universe, regardless of whether or not they exist, and then, of course, one can always abandon mathematics and its worlds to venture with one's faith into the world to come. People with the ilk of Father Arago occupy themselves with this. The difference between us and them is the difference between the possibility that certain things will come to pass and the hope that certain things will come to pass. My field deals with what is possible, accessible, his with what is only hoped for, which becomes accessible face to face only after death. What did you learn when you died? What did you see? Nothing. Therein lies the differentia specifica between science and faith. As far as I know, the fact that those resurrected saw nothing has not shaken the dogmas of religion. The latest eschatology of Christianity holds that a person resurrected forgets his sojourn in the hereafter, that by an act of divine censorship, they don't put it that way, of course, man is forbidden to hop back and forth between this world and the next. Credenti non fit inuria, if it is worth living by such a stretchable faith as Arago does, how much easier it is to accept the paradoxes that allow you to pay a visit to the Quintans. Trust in physics the way Arago trusts in his religion, though physics, unlike religion, is fallible. The choice is yours. Consider, and now go. I have work to do. It was midnight when he got back to his cabin. He thought in turn about Lager and the monk. The physicist was where he belonged, but the other? What did the monk hope for or count on? Missionary work? Had modern theology indeed built an annex to accommodate the extraterrestrial recipients of God's bounty, and was Arago to be its spokesman? Why did he say in the conversation that evil might reign there? Only now did it dawn on him the fear in which the man must be living, not fear for himself, fear for his religion. The monk could consider redemption a gift intended only for humanity, while participating in an expedition to non-human beings, to a place, in other words, where his gospel did not reach. He could think that, and believing in God's omnipresence, he therefore would believe in the omnipresence of individual evil, because the demon who tempted Christ predated the Annunciation and Immaculate Conception. Then didn't the monk carry his dogmas with him, the dogmas by which he lived, to put them in jeopardy? He shook his head and sighed. Lager could ask any question, but the monk, no. The gospel made no mention of what Lazarus had to relate after his resurrection, and so he himself could in no way assist Father Arago, though he had risen from the dead. Religion in self-defense gave such resurrections a different, secular, this worldly name, and therefore was not shaken. Not that he was any expert on religion, but he understood the painful isolation of the monk, for he himself had been isolated, a helpless, passive castaway, taken on board by chance, though no longer. He began to undress for bed, listening to the silence of the Eurydice. She flew near the speed of light. Soon she would be reversing the drive. The clocks in all the quarters would start the countdown, giving the crew time to lie on their bunks, on their backs, and strap themselves in. The spheres of the hull would make a 180-degree turn inside their armored segments. Everything would spin, a moment of confusion, vertigo, then steady once more, still and peaceful. Rather than lash on the stern, the flame of the drive would then hurtle along the bow, forward. Communication with Earth would improve somewhat because of this. News would reach the Eurydice, news many years old, of those whom the crew had left behind on Earth. He would receive no such laser letter, having no one left on Earth. Instead of a past, however, he had a future for which it was worth living. The prehistory of expedition was full of conflict. The project had had a multitude of opponents. Its chance of success, calculated variously, could not be great. A catalogue of the accidents that in one way or another could cause the direction of the expedition numbered in the thousands. Perhaps it was for this reason that the project had been carried out. Its seeming impossibility, its dangers constituted a challenge magnificent enough for people to come forward and undertake. catalogue of the accidents that in one way or another could cause the destruction of the expedition numbered in the thousands. Perhaps it was for this reason that the project had been carried out. Its seeming impossibility, its dangerous constituted challenge magnificent enough for people to come forward and undertake. Before the Eurydice blasted off with growing acceleration, the cost of the enterprise had grown at an even higher exponential rate, as was pointed out by the opponents and critics. But the investments already made possessed their own momentum and drew other investments after them. The financial side of the project occasioned a rumbling no less than Titans upon the takeoff of the Eurydice. The traveler, in his reading, skipped these preliminary crises involving the building of the ships and the repercussions on Earth, such as the manufacturing defects that led to the political corruption scandals. What did this matter to him, who was on board and on his way? On the other hand, he studied the history of astronautics, records of transsolar flights and unmanned probes to Alpha Centauri, and accounts filled with the names of the workers of Grail and Remden. In the hope that he might recognize among them people he had once known well, and possibly be able to follow the thread of that recognition back to the enigma of himself. There were moments before sleep or on waking when he felt close to remembering, particularly since in more than one dream he knew who he was. But all he retained waking was the empty certainty of that identity. A year passed. The Eurydice, breaking, lost its near light speed relative to the Collapsar, which now loomed like a real hole, an absence of stars in the sky. Training, learning, reading, he abandoned his efforts to remember. And yet, though he was now chosen to be one of the co-pilots of the Hermes, in his dreams at night, about which he told no one, he was still the man who had entered Birnam Wood. Beta Harpiae. The Eurydice lost speed, cutting her drive for a few days along a trajectory called an involute toward Beta Harpiae, which was invisible, being a collapsar. She had already crossed at considerable distance. Some buckled isograbs, whose gravitational tides were endurable so far by the crew and by the ship. The course, optimal, chosen by computer was safe, but safe did not mean problem free. The isograbs, lines connecting points of space of the same curvature, ride down the screens like snakes in black flame. Those who were stationed in the parking room, the only control room that ran the ship only under wild variation of the gravitational fields, watched the flickering displays before them, drank beer from cans, and made small talk to pass the time. The fact was that the men were a tradition, a relic from the era of classical astrogation. No one now would even dream of switching the controls to manual. No man possessed reflexes quick enough. The collapsar belonged to a category discovered late and with great difficulty. It was solitary. Easiest to locate were those that belonged to binary systems having companion stars that were alive, i.e., that shined, and from which they stripped the upper layers of the atmosphere. The material was drawn in a contracting spiral toward the black hole to fall into it to the accompaniment of bursts of the hardest X-rays. The gases torn from the companion surrounded the collapsar in an accretion disk, a giant plane highly unhealthy for all objects, including rockets. No ship could navigate such a region. Before it would be sucked into the event horizon, the radiation would destroy both human brain and computer. The solitary collapsar in the constellation Harpy was discovered thanks to the perturbations it produced in the Alpha, Gamma, and Delta stars. I didn't realize that was the last word of the page. Appropriately named Hades, with a mass 400 times that of the Sun, it betrayed its increasing presence by the lack of stars at which it occulted, and by the apparent crowding of stars around its perimeter, as it was a gravitational lens for their light. The surface of annihilation rotated at the equator at 2/3 the speed of light, and the centrifugal and Coriolis forces made it bulge, so that Hades was not a perfect sphere, but even if the event horizon was spherical, gravitational storms came and went over it, compressing and stretching the isographs. The possible causes of these storms or cyclones were provided by 8 theories, each one different. The most imaginative theory, not necessarily the closest to the truth, maintained that Hades was connected in hyperspace to another universe, which gave evidence of itself by producing shock waves in the terrible pit of the collapsar, the center, the singularity, the place without dimension, without time, where the curvature of the continuum acquired a value infinitely great. The theory of the other side of the Hades nucleus, whose infinite space-time compression somehow presented no problem for the transfinite engineers of the alien universe, was really a mathematical fantasy spun by astronomers intoxicated with teratopology, the latest and highly fashionable grandchild of Cantor's ancient theory. They were even going to christen the collapsar Cantor, but its discoverer preferred using mythology. Neither SETI headquarters on Earth nor the command of the Eurydice was particularly concerned about what took place beneath the event horizon for practical, obvious reasons. The horizon was an uncrossable boundary, and regardless of what it covered, it very definitely represented death. Flying in high vacuum above Hades, the Eurydice responded with appropriate maneuvers to each change in gravitation, firing from her rockets streams of heavy elements synthesized from hydrogen and deuterium by the Olimos cycle. Shedding billions of tons, she cleverly maintained stability, while Hades, bound by the laws of conservation, supplied the vessel with a sizable portion of the energy released by all that it swallowed and buried forever in its interior. This was roughly like a balloon holding the altitude at the price of ballast thrown overboard, but only roughly. No pilot would have been able to negotiate such a course. The segmented hull of the ship, made of rings connected by swivel joints, resembled from a distance a mile-long earthworm that writhed like a white comma before the immensity of the black hole. It would have made an interesting sight, no doubt, but there was no. No? Where was I? Oh. But there was no observer, and could be none, since the valiant companion of the Eurydice, the Orpheus, which was to open the gates to hell for her, was unmanned. In constant laser communication with the giant nymph, it awaited the signal that would turn it into a resonance bomb, a single pulse gracer. A similar, though 1,000 times smaller gracer had been tested in the solar system, and in the process deprived Saturn of its second largest moon. When even the laser contact began to worsen, the Orpheus received the final program, and obediently falling silent, commenced the countdown in its machine centers. It drew closer to the collapsar than the Eurydice. Light and every kind of related electromagnetic wave, smeared and bent, driven through the infrared to the radio and ultra radio bands. As Hades twisted the surrounding space, As Hades twisted the surrounding space and time above its horizon of destruction, the Eurydice made the final critical observations of Quinta, the fifth planet of the sixth son of the Harpy, the real destination of the expedition. Ejected previously into space far from the collapse, our cameras took pictures of the planet using no little aperture, 2 astronomical units. The image, or rather the three-dimensional model of Quinta, took focus on the holovision. A hazy blue speckled, cloud-covered sphere hung in the auditorium between the many-leveled galleries. No one, true, watched it there. The holoscope had supposedly been installed in the auditorium because it was donated to the expedition by a Japanese firm for purposes of advertising the product to planetariums on Earth. But though the spectacle was dramatic, it was of no real use to the astrophysicists. They had accepted it because the whole apparatus took up little room in the walls of the forward observatory room, while the planetscope, placed under the transparent dome, filled ornamentally the empty center. Visitors came to view the images of nebulas or planets inside it. There was no other way to look at the cosmic scenery, the whole of the Eurydice being windowless. The survivor from Titan now had a last name, Tempe. Tempe was the valley in which Orpheus first met Eurydice. The name was given him by Ter Horab during a confidential meeting of the scout ship's full crew. Actually, it may not have been Ter Horab who named him. On that occasion, Mark received the position of second co-pilot of the Hermes, and the commander, announcing the assignments, pretended not to notice anything. Logger denied authorship, or rather dodged the question with the joke that they had all fallen under the influence of Greek mythology, as long as the constant gravity on board allowed. As the ship lost speed, Mark visited Logger frequently and listened to his debates with Gold and Nakamura, the astrophysicists. These debates usually turned on the mystery of the civilizations above the window, the ones that had departed from the main road in Ortega and Nilsson's diagram, since nothing was known about their fate. They offered no small challenge to the imagination. The opinions held by the majority of those fascinated by the mystery could be divided roughly in two schools, according to the reason for the silence, whether it was sociological or cosmological. Gold, though a physicist, held to a sociological explanation, an extreme one called socialisis. These debates usually. Oh, wait. The first thing a society did upon entering an era of technological acceleration was to disturb the living environment. Later, it might wish to rescue the environment, but conservation measures would prove insufficient, and the biosphere would be replaced, or necessity inevitably, by artifacts. There would arise an environment completely transformed, though not artificial in the human sense of the word. Artificial to humans was what they produced themselves, natural was what they remained untouched, or was only harnessed like water turning a turbine, or like cultivated earth subjected to agricultural procedures. Above the window, this distinction ceased to exist. If everything became artificial, then nothing was artificial. Production, intelligence, science were transplanted into the surrounding world. Electronics or its unknown counterparts and manifestations took the place of institutions, legislative bodies, government, schools, hospitals. The ethnic identity of national collectives disappeared. Borders disappeared, along with the police, the courts, and the prisons. Then one might have a second Stone Age, universal illiteracy and idleness. Employment would not be required for survival. Anyone who wanted could have employment, of course, because everyone could do absolutely whatever he liked. This did not have to mean stagnation. The environment was an obedient guardian, and to the extent that it was able, it could change itself according to wishes or demands. Could it change so that progress would take place? We had no answer for that, since we ourselves assigned the concept of progress different meanings depending on the historical moment. Could one call scientific progress a situation in which intellectual, creative, cognitive, and constructional activities were so specialized that in each profession one dug deeper in an ever narrower plot of ground? If machines counted faster better than a living being, why should the living being count? If photosynthesis systems produced food that was more nutritious and varied than what farmers, bakers, chefs, and confectioners could supply, then why till soil, or grind flour, or bake bread? A civilization in such socialysis did not broadcast in every direction of the heavens its recipe for the perfect life, and why should it when it no longer even existed as a union formed by an unsatisfied hunger of stomachs and minds? The result would not be a society, but an enormous collection of individuals, and it would be hard, indeed, to find one individual who would choose as his life's work the signaling on a cosmic scale of how he was getting along. The artificial environment would unquestionably be designed by its engineers so that it could not ever acquire the attributes of a planetary personality. Such an artificial environment would be no one, like a meadow, forest, or steppe, with the difference that it would grow and blossom not on its own, not for itself, but for someone, for beings. Would they become stupid from this, turning into dull-witted gluttons that whiled away their hours with toys provided by the planetary guardian? Not necessarily. It depended on the point of view. What was delusion or idleness for one man might be for another a life's passion. We had no standard to measure and evaluate, particularly in the case of other beings, on another world in another period of history different from our own. But Nakamura and Lager favored the cosmological hypotheses. He who explored space would perish in space. Not that he would lose his life, the aphorism had a completely different meaning. Astronomy, astrophysics, space travel, these were but the small, modest beginnings. We ourselves had taken the next step to learning the rudiments of a sidereal engineering, and it was not a matter of expansion, the so-called shockwave of intelligence of yore, where intelligence taking possession of its own and then its neighboring planets was supposed to spread in a stellar immigration throughout the galaxy. For what purpose? To increase the population density of space? No, it was not a matter of crescit et multiplicamini, but concerned things that we could not understand, let alone characterize. Could a chimpanzee understand the labors of a cosmologist? Was the universe nothing but a very large pie and a civilization of child trying to consume the pie as quickly as possible? The notion of invasions by aliens was a projection of the aggressive traits of the predatory, barely civilized ape man, if he himself willingly did unto others as he would rather not be done by. Then he pictured the advanced civilization on much the same principle. Flotillas of galactic battleships were supposed to fall upon unsuspecting little planets to lay hands on the local dollars, diamonds, chocolates, and of course beautiful women, for whom aliens had about as much use as we did for female crocodiles. How then did those above the window occupy themselves? With activities beyond our conception, yet at the same time we could not accept that they were beyond our conception. Here we were about to make a hole in Hades in the temporal onion in order to hide in it. But we were not playing hide and seek. We wished to catch a civilization before it flew out the window. The probability of future expeditions with the same goal was minuscule. Our descendants would perhaps even pay tribute to us, the kind of tribute we paid to the Argonauts who went in search of the Golden Fleece. Yusupov, who also dropped in on Lager, described this view of civilizations beyond the interval of contact as knowledge by unknowledge. But eventually he had to drop out of the discussions because the proximity of the goal required his almost constant presence at the control center. Mark Temp, who knew that he had another name, but said nothing, out of consideration for the doctor, studied the roster of the crew of the Hermes before bed. Of the 10, he knew only Gerbert well, and from the get-togethers at Lager's, the short dark-eyed Nakamura. About the captain under whom he would be serving, he knew next to nothing. The man's name was Steergard. He was Sir Harab's second in command, and his additional specialty was sociodynamic game theory. Every participant of the reconnaissance mission had to have a field that duplicated someone else's, so that in case of an accident or illness, the functioning of the team would not be impaired. The gravistician Pulsar was in charge of the drive of the Hermes. Mark knew him only as an excellent swimmer and diver in the pool on the Eurydice, where he had admired the man's muscular body performing triple twists off the high board. That was not the place to acquaint oneself with the sidereal engineering, so Mark tried tackling the subject on his own in vain. The introduction to it required a familiarity with a sophisticated offshoot of the theory of relativity. The first pilot was Harak, large, heavy, irascible. He also knew information theory and shared with the astromatician Albright the care of the Hermes computer. Or, as that computer once put it, the two humans were entrusted to its care. This was a computer of the last generation, last because no other could have greater calculating power. Limits were imposed by such properties of matter as Planck's constant and speed of light. Greater calculating ability could be achieved only by so-called imaginary computers designed by theorists engaged in pure mathematics and not dependent on the real world. The constructor's dilemma arose from the necessity of satisfying mutually exclusive conditions to pack the most neurons in the smallest volume. The travel time of the signals could not be longer than the reaction time of the components, otherwise the time taken by the signals would limit the speed of calculation. The newest relays responded in 100 billionth of a second. They were the size of atoms, so that an actual computer had a diameter of barely 3 centimeters. A computer any larger than that would be slower. The Hermes computer did indeed take up half the control room, but that was for its peripherals. Decoders, hierarchic assemblers, and so-called hypotheses generators, which, with the linguistic modules, did not operate in real time, but in decisions in critical situations, in extremis, were made by the lightning-swift coat, which was no bigger than a pigeon's egg. It was named DEUCE, Digital Engrammatic Universal System. Not everyone believed that the acronym was accidental. The Hermes was equipped with 2 deuces. The Eurydice had 18, in addition to Steergard, Nakamura, Gerbert, Pulsar, and Harak, all of whom had been chosen for the reconnaissance mission prior to takeoff. Arago was to participate in it as a reserve physician, an unexpected result of the secret balloting, and there was temp in the post of the second pilot, the logician Rotmont, and 2 men selected out of a dozen exobiologists and other experts from the Presidium of SETI on Earth, Christing and Al Salam. In the last weeks of the voyage, the 10 took quarters in the 5th section of the Eurydice, which contained an exact mock-up of the interior of the Hermes, so that they could become familiar both with each other and with the task ahead of them. Every day they played out on the simulators different variants of the approach to Quinta, as well as the tactics of establishing contact with its inhabitants. Another of the men from SETI, Chu, running these simulations, saw to it that the future crew of the Hermes got to know each other well, throwing them into the most fiendish emergencies where accidents coincided with the other accidents, or with flood of incomprehensible signals imitating the voice of the alien planet. No one knew how or why it happened, but during this time the apostolic delegate began to be called not Father, but Dr. Arago. Mark had the impression that the priest himself preferred this. Then the simulations were cut short. Ter Horab summoned the reconnaissance group to brief them on the latest observations in the Zeta system. On the 8 planets of that tranquil Class K star, the 4 inner ones, small with masses on the order of Mercury or Mars, showed a good deal of volcanic activity and hardly an atmosphere. In the distance, Zeta was orbited by 3 gas giants like Jupiter, ringed with powerful stormy atmospheres of superdense hydrogen. Septima, twice as heavy as Jupiter, threw off into space more energy than it received from its sun. Little would have been required to kindle it into a star. Only Quinta, having a 1.5-year period of revolution around Zeta, shone blue, like Earth. Breaks in the white clouds revealed the outlines of oceans and continents. Observation at a distance of nearly 5 light-years presented considerable difficulties. The resolution of the optical instruments on the Eurydice was not adequate to the task, nor were the images beamed up from the orbiters that were sent out sharp enough. Quinto was in its second quarter from the Eurydice's vantage. Half the disk was illuminated. Over it, the spectral lines of water and hydroxyl in large concentrations had just been discovered, as if right at the equator. Quinto was encircled by a belt of remarkably compressed water vapor, yet the belt lay above, outside the atmosphere. The possibility of an ice ring was suggested, whose inner edge touched the top layer of the atmosphere, which meant that before long it would break up. The astrophysicists estimated its mass to be between 3 and 4 trillion tons. If the water came from the ocean would have lost about 20,000 cubic kilometers, not more than 1% of its volume. As it was impossible to find any natural cause for this phenomenon, engineering became highly probable, undertaken for the purpose of lowering the level of the seas, thereby uncovering the continental shelves and creating additional dry land for settlement. On the other hand, the whole operation seemed poorly executed. The frozen fraction of the ocean, not put into an orbit high enough, would have to fall back down after mere several hundred years. Given the scale of the project, this seemed strange, incomprehensible. Things even more mysterious, events, could be observed on Quinta. The electromagnetic noise, emitted unequally from many places on the planet, intensified considerably, as if hundreds of Maxwellian transmitters had been turned on at once. At the same time, the radiation in the infrared increased. With small flashes at the centers, those could be mirrors, focusing sunlight for power plants. But then it turned out that the thermal component of that emission was not great. The spectra of the flashes were not copies of the spectrum of Zeta, as they would have been in the case of their reflection, nor did they resemble the spectra of nuclear explosions. Meanwhile, the radio noise continued to grow, short-wave and medium wave in many bands. The meter-length emission had the look of being modulated. This produced great excitement, particularly when someone garbled the news to the effect that the radiation was directed like radar, or in other words, that the planet had already noticed the Eurydice. The astrophysicists ignored this rumor. No kind of radar could have detected the ship near the collapsar. The mood at 0 hour was jubilant. Beyond all doubt, Quinta was inhabited by a civilization so advanced technologically that it had entered the cosmos not merely in small craft, but with a power able to lift oceans into space. Preparations for takeoff of the scout ship took place in an altered orbit in the relatively calm aphelion of Hades. The piping of the piezoelectric indicators showing the constant change in stresses in the ribs and girders of hull died away. At the same time, on the screens of the takeoff control center, blank until now, there appeared at an angle a glowing spiral arm of the galaxy, and with goodwill and little imagination, one could pick out among the whitish motionless swirls of stars in the dark dust cloud Zeta Harpiae. Its planets were not optically visible. The technicians readied the Hermes for unmooring. In the storage bays at the stern, cranes swiveled. The flanges of the pipes with which the Eurydice filled the hypergolic fuel tanks of the scout ship shuddered under the pressure of the pumps. The head staff checked the systems, drive, navigation, air control, the dynatrons, once through Deucem, once without, employing parallel lines. One by one, the numbered units announced that their programs were ready. Radio range finders and antennas protruded and moved like the horns of a giant snail. The deep bass of the turbines that pumped oxygen to the tunnels in the hold of the Hermes sent subtle vibrations through its stalk-shaped bed. During all this ant-like bustle, the billion-ton Eurydice slowly turned her stern in the direction of the Zeta Harpiae like a cannon about to fire. The crew of the Hermes parted with the commander and their best friends. There were too many people on board the mothership for everyone to shake hands. Then Ter Horab, with those who were able to leave their stations, escorted the crew of the Hermes and stood in the cylindrical passage between the sections, while, after the closing of the large dock gate, the small personnel hatches were shut. And as on a launching chute, the Hermes began to move gradually, white as snow, pushed inch by hydraulic jacks, since the 180,000-ton mass, though weightless, preserved every bit of its inertia. The technicians of the Eurydice, with the biologists Davis and Faradian, were already putting the crew of the Hermes to sleep, a sleep that would last many years, but without ice or hibernation. Instead, they were subjected to embryonization, a process in which people returned to life before birth, a fetal existence, or at least strikingly similar, no breath, underwater. Man's first small steps into space had shown how very terrestrial a creature he was, how poorly adapted to the powerful forces required by the crossing of great distances as rapidly as possible. Violent acceleration crushed the body, especially the lungs, which were filled with the air. The force flattened the rib cage and stopped the circulation of the blood. If the laws of nature could not be bent, then one had to change the astronauts to conform to them. Embryonization accomplished this. First, the blood was replaced with an oxygen-carrying fluid that also possessed other properties of blood, from coagulability to the immunological functions. This fluid, white as milk, was onyx. After the body's temperature was lowered to that of hibernating animals, closed vessels were surgically reopened, vessels through which the fetus at one time had exchanged blood with the placenta in the mother's womb. Though the heart now continued to work, Respiration ceased in the lungs, which collapsed and filled with onyx. When there was no air remaining in either the rib cage or intestines, the unconscious man was immersed in a liquid as incompressible as water. The astronaut then was locked inside an embryonator, a container in the shape of a 2-meter torpedo that kept the body above freezing and supplied it with the nutritive substances and oxygen. Onyx was pumped into the organism by artificial vessels through the navel. A man thus prepared could withstand tremendous pressures without harm. Like bathypelagic fish, which were not crushed at depths of miles beneath the ocean because the outside pressure equaled the pressure within their tissues, the liquid in the embryonator was kept, therefore, at hundreds of atmospheres per square centimeter of body surface. Each such container on the ship was held in swinging suspension by pincers. The astronauts lay in their armored cocoons like giant pupas, in such a way that acceleration and deceleration hit them always chest first. The bodies, now more than 85% water and onyx, already airless, were as compression-resistant as water. Thanks to this, there was no problem in maintaining a constant acceleration of 20 Gs, at which a body weighed 2 tons, and moving the ribs to breathe would have been a task beyond even an athlete. But the embryonists did not breathe, and the limit of their durability for stellar flight was fixed only by the delicate molecular structure of the cells. When 10 hearts in full embryonizative compression were beating only a few times per minute, Deuce assumed charge of the unconscious. And the people of the Eurydice returned on board. The operators then disconnected the computers of their mothership from the Hermes. Except for the dead cables, nothing now joined the two craft. The Eurydice ejected the scout ship from her wide-open stern, which was ringed with the giant plates of an expanding photon mirror. Her steel claws extending tore away the useless cables like threads and thrust the hull of the Hermes into the void. Then the Hermes side engines glowed with pale ionic flame. But the impulse was too weak to move it from its place. Such an enormous mass could not acquire speed suddenly. The Eurydice drew in her catapults and closed the stern, and everyone observing the takeoff from her control room breathed a sigh of relief. Deuce, correct to the fraction of a second, took over. The hypergolic boosters of the Hermes, silent until now, fired. To build impetus, the batteries fired in sequence. At the same time, the ionic engines blazed full force. Their blue transparent flame mixed with the blinding glare of the boosters. The hull, wrapped in shimmering heat, moved smoothly, evenly, into the eternal night. In the darkened control room, the reflection from the screens made the faces of those who stood by the commander deathly pale. The Hermes, sending toward them a lengthening tail of steady flame, grew more distant as its speed increased. When the telemeters indicated the necessary distance, and when at the edge of the field of vision an empty cylinder tumbled end over end in freefall up to the last minute it had connected the Hermes and the Eurydice, and now shot by the starting salvos, It flew off into the darkness, the mirror of the billion-ton ship locked in place. Through the central opening, the blunt cone of an emitter slowly emerged. It flashed once, twice, 3 times until a column of light stabbed space and hit the Hermes. In both control rooms of the Eurydice there was a triumphant cheer, and it must be confessed an exclamation of surprise, too, that the thing had gone off so well. The Hermes soon vanished from the visual monitors. The screens showed only dwindling glowing circles, as if an invisible giant had lit a cigarette among the stars and blown rings of white smoke. Finally these rings fused into a trembling point that was the mirror of the scout ship reflecting the Eurydice's driving laser. Terhorab returned to his cabin before the scene was over. He had 79 difficult hours ahead of him, of sidereal manipulations with the gracer of the Orpheus to create a temporal port into the gravitational resonances, and then to enter it, or rather to become submerged in it, since this meant being cut off completely from the outside world. The ignition order sent to the Orpheus took 2 days to reach it, and it was in this time that several strange phenomena took place on the Quinta. Up until the moment that their instruments were totally blinded, the astrophysicists turned into the entire galactic emission from the region of the Harpy. The spectra of the Alpha, Delta, and Zeta stars in no way changed, which was an important test of the quality of the reception of Quinta. The radiation reaching the Eurydice from the planet was filtered, and the different exposures were compared, superimposed, and sharpened by computer cascade amplifiers. At the highest visual magnification, the Zeta system was a spot that a match head held at arm's length would cover. The attention of the paleontologists was focused naturally on planetologists was focused naturally on Quinta. Its spectro and holograms created not so much an image of the planet as a computer guess. Because the source of information was diverging photons spread out erratically over the whole spectrum of radiation, there was at the observatory on the Eurydice, just as at the observatories on Earth long ago, with the first telescopes, no agreement of the critical question of what was actually seen and what was only seemed to be seen. The mind of man, like any system processing information, could not draw a sharp line between certainty and conjecture. Observation was hindered by Quinta's sun Zeta, by the gas plume of its largest globe, Septima, and by the strong emission of the stellar background. So far it was found that in many physical respects Quinta did resemble Earth. The atmosphere contained 29% oxygen. There was plenty of water vapor and about 60% nitrogen. The white polar caps, having high albedo, could be seen even from the vicinity of Earth's sun. The ring of ice must have arisen during the flight of the Eurydice, or at least reached the proportions that made it visible. Now viewed from the cosmic neighborhood, the artificial nature of Quinta's radio intensity was beyond question. Discharges from atmospheric storms could not possibly have been a factor in radio intensity in the shortwave range. Quinta equaled the corresponding emissions of its own sun. The same thing had happened with Earth after the global spread of television. The results of the observations made shortly before the plunge into the gravitational harbor were a shock. Ter Horab immediately summoned the experts. The Council's only line of action was to diagnose as quickly as possible what was taking place on the planet, and to send that message after the scout ship. The message, coded in the alphabet of high-energy quanta, would overtake the Hermes and its unconscious crew. Deuce would receive the message and convey it to the people upon their reanimation at the edge of the Zeta system. The stellar message was to be encoded so that only Deuce could read it. Caution was indicated. The changes on Quinto were alarming. 1. Several series of the brief flashes above the thermosphere and ionosphere of the planet had been recorded, also between it and its moon, about 200,000 kilometers from Quinta. The flashes lasted 30 to 40 nanoseconds. Spectrally, they matched the solar emission, with the radiation cut off in the infrared and ultraviolet. 2. After each of these series of flashes, which took many hours, there appeared... What? Hmm? Okay, I've lost my face. Alright, sorry, I've lost my place. Okay, there appeared on the face of the planet in the intertropical zone dark streaks on both sides of the ice ring. 3. At the same time, the emission of approximately meter-length waves increased, exceeding all previously observed maxima, while the emission of the southern hemisphere weakened. 4. Immediately before the council met, a bolometer aimed at the center of the planet's face registered a sharp drop of temperature on the order of 180 degrees Kelvin, with a slow return to equilibrium. The cold spot had an area equal to Australia. At first the cloud cover vanished above the spot, surrounding it on all sides with a very bright embankment of clouds. Before the clouds returned, the bolometer located the cold source at a single point in the exact center of the spot. Thus the sudden cooling had expanded from a source of unknown nature. And a circular front. 5. On Quinto's large moon, there appeared in the dark hemisphere, not facing the sun, a point flash that flickered, moved independently of the motion of the moon's surface, as if just above the crust, through an arc of 1/10,000th of a second, a flame traveled, made of atomic plasma at a temperature of 1,000,000 degrees Kelvin. 6. As the council began deliberating, A cold spot disappeared beneath the clouds, and then the cloud cover obscured the surface of Quinta to an extent unprecedented, 92% of the planet's face. The opinions of the specialists, as one might have guessed, were divided. The first hypothesis that leapt to mind of nuclear explosions, whether as tests or warfare, could be discarded without further discussion. These flashes had nothing in common spectrally either with explosions of the uranides or with thermonuclear reactions. The exception was the plasmatic spark on the moon, but its thermonuclear spectrum was continuous. The opinions of the specialists, as one might have guessed, were divided. The first hypothesis that leapt to mind of nuclear explosions, whether as tests or warfare, could be discarded without further discussion. Okay. One thought of an open hydrogen-helium reactor in a magnetic vise. To the nucleonics people, the purpose of such a reactor was a mystery. The flashes in space near the planet could come from specially tuned lasers hitting metallic objects, nickel and magnetic meteors possibly, or from the collision of bodies of high iron, nickel, and titanium content if they collided head-on and at speeds on the order of 80 to 100 kilometers per second. But neither could one rule out as a source converter mirrors, which absorbed a portion of the sun's waves exploding because of malfunctions. The council got into a heated debate. The experts disagreed with one another. There was talk of climate control with the aid of very large photoconverters and of photoelectric cells, which, however, had no connection with the focus of cold at the equator. But the most astounding thing was the result of the Fourier analysis done on the entire radio spectrum of Quinta. All trace of modulation disappeared, while at the same time the power of the transmitters increased. All trace of modulation disappeared while at the same time the power of the transmitters increased. A radio location map of the planet showed hundreds of transmitters of white noise, which merged into shapeless blotches. Quinto was emitting noise on all wavelengths. The noise was either the scrambling of broadcast signals or a kind of coded communication concealed by the semblance of chaos, or else it was chaos indeed, created intentionally. Terhorab demanded an immediate answer to the question of what should be beamed to the Hermes within the next few hours, since all contact with it would be severed after that. More to the point, for what should the reconnoiteurs prepare themselves, and how should they proceed once they were in the Zeta system? The reconnaissance program had been worked out long before, but it was obviously impossible for them to have taken into account the phenomena just observed. At first no one was anxious to take the floor. Finally the astronomician Tayum, as a spokesman for the advisory group SETI, said with undisguised reluctance that no helpful advice could be sent to the Hermes. They should list the facts, provide a hypothetical explanation. and rely on the independent judgment of the crew. Ter Horab wanted to hear some hypotheses. It did not matter if they were mutually contradictory. Whatever the changes on Quinta are, they are not signals directed at us, said Tayum. On that we are all agreed. Some believe that Quinta has noticed our presence and is preparing itself in its own way to receive the Hermes. This is not an idea based on rational data. It is simply, in my opinion, an expression of anxiety, or to put it plainly, fear. A very old and primitive fear which at one time gave rise to nightmares of cosmic invasion. I consider such an explanation of the phenomena to be nonsense. Ter Horab preferred specifics. The people of the reconnaissance mission could decide for themselves whether they should be afraid or not. It was the mechanism of the new phenomena that interested him. provide a hypothetical explanation and rely on the independent judgment of the crew. Ter Horab wanted to hear some hypotheses. It didn't matter if they are mutually contradictory. Whatever the changes on Quinta are, they are not signals directed at us, said Tyam. On that we are all agreed. Some believe that Quinta has noticed our presence and is preparing itself in its own way to receive Hermes. This is not an idea based on rational data. It is simply, in my opinion, an expression of anxiety, or to put it plainly, fear. A very old primitive fear, which at one time gave rise to nightmares of cosmic invasion. I consider such an explanation on the phenomena to be nonsense. Ter Horab preferred specifics. The people of the reconnaissance mission could decide for themselves whether they should be afraid or not. It was the mechanism of the new phenomena that interested him. Our astrophysicists have specific hypotheses. They can present them, replied Toyam, unruffled by the sarcasm of the commander's words, since it was not directed at him. Who? Asked Ter Horab. Time indicated Neidstedt and Fecteau. The jumps in temperature and albedo could have been caused by a meteor swarm entering the Quintus system and colliding with artificial satellites that could have produced the flashes, said Neidstedt. How do you explain the similarity of the surface flashes to the spectrum of Zeta? Some of the satellites of Quinta could be hunks of ice broken off from the outer edge of the ring. They would reflect the sunlight in our direction only at certain angles of incidence and reflection randomly. They would be irregular solids with different orbital moments. And what about the cold spot? Asked the commander. Who knows the possible ways it could have come about? That's unclear. Though we could come up with some natural mechanism. An ad hoc hypothesis, Tyam remarked. I talked this over with the chemists, said Lager. An endothermic reaction could have taken place there. I'm not comfortable with such an oddity, I admit, but there are compounds that absorb heat when they react. The accompanying circumstances, however, point to something more dramatic. To what? Asked Ter Horab. An unnatural cause, though not necessarily one that has intention. For example, an accident in some enormous refrigeration devices and cryogenic equipment, like a fire in an industrial complex, but with a negative sign, but this doesn't seem very likely to me either. I have no facts on which to base such an assertion, none of us have, but the very proximity of time of all these changes suggests that they are somehow connected. The value of your hypothesis also has a negative sign, said one of the physicists. I don't think so. The reduction of many unknowns to a common unknown denominator represents a gain, not a loss in information, replied Lager easily. Please go on, the commander said to him. Lager stood. I'll say what I can. An infant smiling smiles according to assumptions that it has brought with it into the world. These assumptions of a statistical nature are multitudinous. That the pinkish blobs its little eyes perceive are people's faces, that people usually react positively to the smile of a baby, and so on. What is your point? That everything is based on certain assumptions, though the assumptions, as a rule, are made silently. Our discussion deals with the events that appear very improbable as a series of unrelated things, the flashes, the chaotic emission, the changes in Quintus albedo, the plasma on the moon. What caused them, you ask? The activity of a civilization? Does this clarify anything? On the contrary, it mystifies, because we began with the tacit assumption that we would be able to understand the actions of the Quintans. Mare, as I recall, was once considered old and Venus young in comparison with Earth. The great-grandfathers of our astronomers automatically assumed that Earth was the same as Mars and Venus, except younger than the first and older than the second, hence the canals of Mare, the wild jungles of Venus, etc., which eventually all had to be chucked out as fairy tales. I don't think anything could behave as unintelligently as intelligence. There may be a mind on Quinta, or minds inaccessible to us because of a difference in purposes. War? The voice came from the back of the hall. Lager, still standing, continued. War is not an absolutely closed set of conflicts with destruction as the resultant. Commander, don't count on being enlightened. Since we know neither the initial states nor the parameters, nothing can turn the unknowns into knowns. All we can tell the Hermes is to proceed with caution. You would prefer more specific advice? I can only offer two possibilities. The actions of those intelligences are unintelligent, or else unintelligible, not fitting in the categories of our thought. But this is only an opinion, nothing more. I feel like I need to get some water. So I'm going to quickly do that before I start reading the next chapter. I'll go downstairs and drink some water. Hello. I hope you're all doing well. Quinta. Before the plunge, the radio locators tracked the Hermes for the last time, showing how it described a great hyperbola across the firmament, rising higher and higher above the arm of the galactic spiral in order that in deep vacuum it could travel near the speed of light. Then the radio echoes began to arrive at increasing intervals, a sign that the Hermes was experiencing relativistic effects, that its on-board time was diverging from the time of the Eurydice. All contact between the scout ship and the mother ship terminated when the signals from the automatic transmitter grew in wavelength, spread to bands of many kilometers, and weakened. The last signal was noted by the most sensitive indicator in the 70th hour after the start, just as Hades, hit by the suiciding Orpheus, groaned in gravitational resonance and opened wide its temporal chasms. Whatever might happen to the scout ship and the men locked within it would have to remain unknown for many years of their time, for those who slept the sleep of embryonization, a sleep like death, devoid of dreams or any awareness, through dreams of the passage of time. The flight had no duration. Over the white sarcophagi in the tunnel-like embryonator, through the armored glass of the periscope shone Alpha Harpiae, a blue giant that had been deflected from the other stars of the constellation by one of its own asymmetric eruptions, as it was young and not yet stabilized after the nuclear ignition of its interior. When the Eurydice vanished, Zeus took over the controls. The Hermes, having climbed above the ecliptic, plummeted like a stone toward Hades, initially retreating from the star of its destination in order to reach it more easily at the gravitational cost of the collapsar. Circling the collapsar, it received from its field a hefty push. Then, at the speed of approaching light, the Hermes extended from its sides the intakes of the flow stream reactors. Space was so empty that the collected atoms were insufficient for ignition. Zeus therefore excited the hydrogen with injections of titanium until the synthesis finally started. The throats of the engines, black until now, filled with light that pulsed faster and more intensely. Fiery columns of helium spouted into the darkness. The Eurydice's laser had given the scout ship less help at the takeoff than expected, since one of the hypergolic boosters misfired. which moved the stern mirror off course, and then the Eurydice disappeared, as if swallowed by the void. But Zeus quickly made up for the loss with power borrowed from Hades. At 99% of the speed of light, the space in the engine intakes grew denser. There was more than enough hydrogen. The constant acceleration increased the mass of the scout ship. Zeus held to 20 Gs without the least deviation. The structure, designed to withstand 4 times such a thrust, suffered no damage, but no living organism larger than a flea could have borne its own weight on that flight. Each man weighed over 2 tons. Under that crush he could not have moved his ribs if he had had to breathe, and his heart would have burst trying to pump a fluid far heavier than liquid lead. But they did not breathe, and their hearts now did not beat, though they lived. The crew lay in the same liquid medium that had replaced their blood, pumps that would have functioned at 100 times the gravity, though the embryonized could not have endured that, pushed onax through their vessels, and the hearts contracted once or twice a minute, not working, but instead passively moved by the influx of the life-giving artificial blood. At the right moment, Zeus executed a change of course. Heading now straight for the co-rotating swirl of stars of the galaxy, the Hermes threw out in front of its prow a protective shield. The shield preceded the ship by several miles, seemingly stationary at that distance. It served as a radiation screen. Otherwise, as the speed mounted, cosmic rays would have destroyed too many neurons in the human brains. The blue alpha now shone astern. Inside the long tunnel hold of the Hermes, however, it was not completely dark. The insulation around the reactors allowed microscopic leakage of quanta, and the walls glowed with the Chernikov radiation. This pale twilight seemed quiescent, perfectly still, unchanging. Only twice through the thick window of the barrier that separated the embryonator from the upper deck were the sharp, sudden flashes. The first time a control monitor of the protective shield, blank until then, blazed a cold white and immediately went out. Zeus, awakened in a terasecond, gave the necessary order. Current turned levers. The prow of the ship opened and spat flame. A new shield, ejected forward, replaced the one destroyed by a handful of cosmic dust. The dust from the speed of impact had turned the shielding disk into an incandescent cloud of split atoms. The Hermes flew through this solar firework, which then stretched far in its wake and pressed on. The auto required a few seconds to stop the unwanted lateral motion of the new shield, whose port and starboard orange lights blinked more and more slowly, as if a sleepy black cat were winking meaningfully at Zeus. Then everything was again still on the ship until the next striking of grains from the meteorite or comet trail, when the operation of renewing the protective shield was repeated exactly. Finally, the flickering electrons in the Cetesian clocks gave the awaited signal. Zeus did not need to look at any indicators. The indicators were its senses, and it read their state directly with its brain, which, because of its 3-centimeter size, the jokers of the Eurydice, had been the bird brain. Zeus kept careful track of the luminal readouts to maintain the course during the reduction of the drive. The engines, cut and turned around, began to brake the ship. This maneuver, too, was carried out perfectly. The guiding stars did not so much as budge in the sights, so there was no need for any programmed correction of the trajectory. The idea was that the reduction of a near-light velocity to a parabolic velocity with respect to zeta, that is, down to some 80 kilometers a second per microparsec before reaching Juno, the outermost planet of the system, would require a simple reversal of the drive until it went out by itself from lack of hydrogen. Then the hypergolics could be used for braking, but Zeus had received the warning from Eurydice in time, and before beginning the reanimation procedures, it reprogrammed the approach. The technological artificial nature of both the light from the hydrogen-helium exhaust cones and the flame of self-igniting fuels was easily identified, and Zeus's first rule now was that of extremely limited trust in our brothers in intelligence. It had never studied the Bible, had never analyzed the incident of Cain and Abel, yet it shut off the flow stream engines in the shadow of Juno, and used the planet's gravity to reduce speed and change course. The second gas glow of Zeta served it to drop down to a parabolic velocity. Only then did it activate the reanimators. At the same time, it sent remote control robots outside to place on the nozzles of the stern and prow a camouflaging device, an electromagnetic mixer. From now on, the flame of the drive would be blurred, its radiation spectrally dispersed. The most delicate stage of the breaking occurred at the threshold of the system behind Juno. Deuce planned and performed it deftly, as befitted a computer of the ultimate generation. It simply had the Hermes cut through the upper layers of gas giant's atmosphere. A cushion of blazing plasma was created before the ship, losing speed in it. Deuce wrung everything it could out of the Hermes air control system to keep the temperature in the embryonator from rising more than 2 degrees. In an instant, the plasma cushion destroyed the protective shield, which in any case was to have been discarded. The shield was replaced by one of another type for protecting against dust and comet fragments and planetary orbits. The Hermes was blinded in the fiery passage, but cooled while still in Juno's cone of shadow. Deuce made sure that the flaming clouds caused by the braking maneuver, practically prominences, subsided on the heavy planet in accordance with Newton's laws. Thus not only the presence but the trail of Hermes was effaced. The ship, engines extinguished, drifted in a far aphelion, while in the embryonator all the lights went on and the heads of the metacoms hung over the containers, ready to begin. According to the program, Gerbert was to be the first to awaken, to intervene as a doctor should intervention be necessary. But here the sequence of the procedure was broken. The biological factor, despite everything, remained the weakest link in the chain of these complex operations. The embryonator was housed in the middle deck, and compared with the ship, was a microscopic shell surrounded by many layers of armor and by anti-radiation insulation. It had 2 escape hatches that led to living quarters. The center of the Hermes, called the village, was connected by shafts to the 2-level control room. Between the forward bulkheads ran decks with a row of laboratories equipped to function in weightlessness as well as under gravity. The power stores were situated at the stern, in annihilative containers in the sidereal engine room not accessible to personnel, and in the chambers that had a special purpose. Between the outer and inner hulls of the stern were concealed landing gear units, for the ship was able to set down on planets standing on extended jointed girder legs. But first the stretch of the ground would have to be tested, because on each one of the craft's enormous pawls would rest 30,000 tons of weight. In the ship's midsection, on the starboard side, reconnaissance probes were stored, with their accessories and attachments. On the port side were service robots and search robots, capable of long, independent reconnoitering by flight or on foot, and these included striders. When Deuce turned on the reanimation systems, the Hermes was weightless, a favorable condition for the operation. Roused first, Gerbert regained a normal pulse and body temperature, but did not awaken. Deuce examined him carefully and hesitated, faced with a decision. He was compelled to act independently. More precisely, he did not hesitate, but compared various probability distributions of success. The result of this anamnesis was binomial. Deuce could either reanimate the captain, steer guard, or take the physician from the embryonator and transport him to the operating room. It did as a man who, in the face of unknowns, flips a coin. When one does not know which course is better, the best tactic is to make a purely random choice. The random generator indicated the captain, and Deuce obeyed it. 2 hours later, Steerguard, still half-conscious, sat up in the open embryonator, tearing through the transparent membrane that clung to his naked body. He looked around, but did not see one who should have been standing over him. The speaker was saying something. He realized that the voice was mechanical, that something had happened to Gerbert, though he had difficulty understanding the words that were repeated over and over. When he tried to get up, he hit his head against the not fully raised lid of the embryonator, which dazed him for a moment. The first sound of human speech in the Zeta system was an obscenity. Beads of sticky white fluid flew from Steerguard's hair onto his face and chest. He straightened too quickly, and somersaulting with bent knees, flew down the tunnel past all the containers of people to the hatch in the wall. His shoulders pressed against soft padding in the corner between the hatch frame and the ceiling. Wiping from his eyes the milky fluid which stuck to his fingers, he took in the whole cylindrical interior of the embryonator, and the gap between the rows of sarcophagi with their raised lids The door to the showers was now open. He listened to the machine voice. Gerbert, like the others, was alive, but had not awakened when his umbilical cord was disconnected. It could not be anything serious. The electroencephalograms and electrocardiograms were perfectly normal. "Where are we?" he asked. "Behind Juno. "The flight went smoothly. Should I move Dr. Gerbert to the operating room?" Steergard considered. "No, I'll look at him myself. What's the condition of the ship?" "Fully functioning. Did you receive any radio messages from the Eurydice?" "Yes." "What level of importance?" "First, should I give the text?" "What does it concern?" "A change of plans. Should I give the text?" "How long is the message?" 3,660 words. Should I give the text?" "Summarize it." "I cannot summarize unknowns." "How many unknowns?" "That too is an unknown." During this exchange, Steergard kicked off from the ceiling, flying toward the green and red light above Gerbert's cryotainer. He was able to get a glimpse of himself in the mirror in the passageway to the showers, a muscular torso glistening with onax, which still trickled in beads from the stump of the tied umbilical cord as if an enormous newborn. "What happened?" he asked, wedging his bare feet under the doctor's container. He put a hand on his chest. The heart beat steadily. On the slightly parted lips of the sleeper was viscous white onax. "Give what stuff in it," he said. Meanwhile, he pressed his thumbs behind the man's jaw, looked into the mouth, felt the warmth of the breath, put a finger between the teeth, and carefully touched the palate. Gerbert started and opened his eyes. They were full of tears, as bright and clear as water. Steergard noted with quiet satisfaction the effectiveness of so primitive a method of reviving. Gerbert had not awakened because the clamp of the umbilical cord was not completely shut. Steergard pinched the catheter, which snapped away, squirting white fluid. The cord closed itself off. With both hands, he pressed the man's chest, feeling the skin stick to his palms. Gerbert stared at him wide-eyed, as if astounded. "Everything's okay," said Steergard. The one he was massaging did not seem to hear. "Deuce, yes? What happened?" "The Eurydice Quinta." "There were changes on Quinta." "Give the general picture." "A picture of unclear things is unclear. Tell what you know." Before the plunge, high-frequency jumps in the albedo took place. Radio emission went to 300 gigawatts of white noise. On the moon, a white point moved, recognized as plasma in a magnetic vise. Recommendations? Caution, camouflage. Specifically, what are we to do? To use our best judgment. The distance to Quinta? 1,300,000,000 miles on a straight line. The camouflage? I have done it. Mixers? Yes. Have you changed the program? Only for the approach. The ship is in the shadow of Juno. And the ship is all right? Fully functioning. Should I reanimate the crew? No. Have you observed Quinta? No, I lost cosmic velocity in the thermosphere of Juno, and fine. Now be silent and wait. I will be silent and wait. An odd beginning, thought Steergard, still kneading the doctor's chest. The doctor sighed and moved. "Do you see me?" the naked captain asked him. Don't speak. Blink." Gerbert blinked, then smiled. Steergard was covered with sweat, but continued to massage him. "Diautochokinesia?" he suggested. The man lying prone closed his eyes. With an unsteady hand touched the tip of his nose. Then they looked at each other and grinned. The doctor bit his knees. "You want to get up? Don't rush." Saying nothing, Gerbert gripped the sides of his bed and lifted himself. But instead of sitting up, he rose into the air. "Careful, 0G." Steergard reminded him. "Easy." Now fully conscious, Gerbert looked around the embryonator. "How are the others?" he asked, brushing aside the hair stuck to his forehead. "The reanimation is underway. Should I help, Dr. Gerbert?" asked Deuce. "It's not necessary," said the doctor. One by one, he himself was checking the dials above the sarcophagi. He touched chests, thumbed eyelids open, tested the conjunctional reflexes. There was a rush of water and exhaust fans from the bathroom. Steergard was taking a shower. By the time the doctor got to the last one, Nakamura, the captain, already in shorts and a black tricot t-shirt, had returned from his cabin. "How are the men?" he asked. "All healthy. Rotmont has a trace of arrhythmia." "Stay with them. I'll read the mail." "News?" "News 5 years old. Good or bad?" "Enigmatic." Terra Horab advised a change of program. They saw something on Quinta before the plunge, also on the moon. "What does it mean?" Steergard stood at the door as the doctor helped Rotmont to his feet. 3 men were already washing themselves. The others floated around, met, looked in the mirror, all trying to talk at once. "Let me know when they come around. We have time." With these words, the captain pushed off, and the hatch flew between naked bodies as if among white fish underwater, and disappeared into a passage to the control room. After considering the situation, Steerguard took the ship up above the ecliptic plane, emerging from the cone of shadow at the lowest drive to make the first observations of Quinta. It shone as crescent near the sun, completely covered with clouds. Its noise had increased to 400 gigawatts. The Fourier analyzers showed no kind of modulation. The Hermes was now wrapped in a veil that absorbed non-thermal radiation so that it could not be located by radar. Steerguard preferred to err on the side of caution. A technological civilization meant astronomy, and astronomy meant sensitive bolimeters, whereby even an asteroid warmer than space could call attention to itself. To the water vapor now used for maneuvering, he added some sulfides, the kind of abundant in seismic gases. Volcanically active asteroids were a rarity, true, especially with such a mass as small as that of the scout ship, but the circumspect captain sent out probes, then aimed them back at himself to make sure that the use of the vapor jets necessary for future flight corrections would go unnoticed even when the vessel eventually descended to Quinta. His intention was to steal up on the side of the moon in order to examine it in detail. By now everyone was gathered in the zero-gravity control room. It resembled the inside of a large globe, with a conical recess closed in by a wall of monitors. The seats were covered with a fastening material. If you gripped the arms and pressed your body down into the chair, the fabric would hold you firmly. If you wanted to get up, you pushed away in one strong motion. It was simpler and better than straps. They sat, all 10 of them, as in a small projection room, and 40 screens showed the planet, each in a different range of the spectrum. The largest central monitor could synthesize the monochromatic images, superimposing them as instructed. Through the breaks in the clouds, furled by trade winds and cyclones, deeply notched, blurred coastlines appeared. The light, filtered in stages, allowed them to see the now cloud surface, and now the surface of the globe concealed beneath it. Meanwhile, they listened to the lecturing monotone of Deuce, which repeated the last radiogram from the Eurytus. Lo Bianco had raised the possibility of seismically caused damage to the technological infrastructure of the Quintans. Field and a few others held to this hypothesis, which they termed environmental. The inhabitants of the planet had thrown part of the ocean waters into space in order to increase the land area. The pressure exerted by the ocean on the ocean floor decreased, and as a result, the equilibrium of the lithosphere was disturbed. The upward force from within produced great cracks in the crust, which was thinnest beneath the ocean. Therefore, hurling of water into space was discontinued. In short, the enterprise backfired catastrophically, but others believed that this hypothesis was false, as it failed to take into account additional incomprehensible phenomena. Moreover, beings able to work on the planetary scale would surely have foreseen the seismic consequences. According to the calculations that used Earth as a model, cataclysmic movements of the lithosphere could not be produced by the removal of less than 1/4 of the ocean's volume. The reduction of pressure from the ejection of even 6 trillion tons of water would not cause global devastation. Another hypothesis suggested a disaster of the chain reaction type as the undesired effect of gravitological experiments got out of control. Other notions included the deliberate destruction of an outmoded technological base, a kind of demolition, the unintentional disruption of the climate during the hurling of the water into space, and civilizational chaos of unknown causes. None of the hypotheses was able to encompass all of the observed phenomena to form a coherent whole. Thus, the radiogram sent by Ter Horab immediately before the Eurydice's entrance into Hades authorized the reconnaisseurs to act independently and to dispense with any of the established variants of the program if they saw fit. Oops. I don't know why. It's like I don't know. My jaw's just getting tired, but it's like I feel like somehow after a while of reading, sometimes like my mouth goes numb. It seems like I don't know why. Like it's starting to do that again right now. And it's not even that cold. So I'm not exactly sure what's wrong. Like why that is. I don't know. I'm trying to pop my neck because it feels like maybe it could be some sort of thing to do with my neck. Okay, that's weird. So it's apparently further down, like the muscles around the shoulders. That's what's causing it. Because that's where the pain is. More stiffness. Like it's more stiff there. Okay, I think I mostly got it. Hunting. At the aphelion of Zeta, far from its larger planets, Steergard put the ship into an elliptical orbit so the astrophysicists could make their observations of Quinta. As usual in such systems, there were drifting remnants of old comets stripped of their gas trails and broken into frozen boulders by repeated passages past the sun. Among these scattered rocks and patches of dust, Deuce noticed 4,000 kilometers away an object unlike a meteor. Touched by the radio locator, it gave a metallic reflection. It could not be a hunk of magnetite with a high iron content. The shape was too regular. It resembled a moth with short, thick abdomen and blunt stubs of wings. 4 degrees warmer than icy rock, it did not rotate as a meteor or the fragment of a comet core should have, but traveled straight with no sign of propulsion. Deuce examined it in all the spectral bands until it discovered the reason for the thing's stability, a faint outflow of argon, an attenuated stream, and therefore barely visible. It could be a space probe or a small ship. Let's catch that moth, Steergard decided, so the Hermes was set on a trajectory of pursuit. At less than a mile from the prey it discharged a missile that had prehensile arms. The snare opened its jaws wide exactly over the back of the peculiar moth and grasped the thing's sides in a vice. The thing, inert, seemed to fly passively in the grip, but after a moment its temperature rose and the stream of gas at its rear intensified. The monitor, till now showing the close correlation between the hunt program and its progress, flashed question marks. "Turn on the absorption field?" asked Deuce. "No," said Steergard. He watched the bolometer. The trapped object heated to 300, 400, 500 degrees Kelvin, yet its drive increased only slightly. The temperature curve peaked, then fell. The captured thing cooled. "What's the drive?" asked the captain. Everyone in the control room was silent, looking for the visual monitor to the side screens, which were for emissions outside the visible range. Only the bolometer glowed. "Radioactivity zero?" "Zero," Deuce assured the captain. "The jet is weakening. What now?" "Nothing. We wait." "They flew thus for a long time. Why not take it on board?" El Salam suggested finally. "We could x-ray the thing first." "No point. It's dead. The drive is out and cold. Deuce, show it up close." Through the electronic eyes in the pincers they saw a black carapace, pockmarked and corroded. "Take it on board?" asked Deuce. "Not yet. Trap it a couple of times. Not too hard." From between the long-armed pincers emerged an oval-ended rod. Methodically it struck the held whole, raising a fine spray of ash flakes. "It might have a non-percussive detonator," remarked Polisar. "I think I would x-ray it." "All right," Steergard agreed unexpectedly. "Deuce, run an SG on it. 2 spindle-shaped probes shot from the prow caught up with the squat moth and aligned themselves on either side of it. The upper monitors in the control room came to life, showing tangled strips, bands, shadows, and simultaneously atomic symbols appeared along the edges of the screens: carbon, hydrogen, silicon, manganese, chromium. The columns of letters lengthened until Rotmont said, "This is no good. It should be taken on board." "Risky," muttered Nakamura. "Better to take it apart by remotes." "Deuce?" asked the captain. "It is possible. It will require 5 to 10 hours. Should I begin?" "No, send a teletome. Let it cut open the hole in the thinnest place and give us a picture of the interior." "Bore and broach? Fine." The probes surrounding the prey were joined by another. A diamond drill met with a hole no less hard. Only a laser, Deuce decided. A problem. Use the minimum pulse so as not to melt anything inside. "That I cannot guarantee," replied Deuce. "Should I laser?" "Delicately." The drill retracted and disappeared. On the pitted surface a white point glowed, and when the smoke cleared, a telephoto head entered the melted hole. Its monitor showed blackened tubing that went into a bulging plate, and the whole image trembled slightly. Then Deuce spoke. "Caution! According to the SG, at the center of the object are excisions and virtual particles warping configurational Fermi space." "How do you interpret that?" asked Steerguard. "The pressure at the center is over 400,000 atmospheres, or else this is a Holenbach quantum effect." "A kind of bomb?" "No, probably the power source. The propellant was argon. There is none left." "Can we take it on board?" "We can. The net energy of the whole is equal to 0, except for the physicist." No one had any idea what this meant. "Shall we?" the captain asked Nakamura. The Japanese smiled. "Who am I to argue with Deuce?" He turned to Al-Salam. "And what do you think?" Al-Salam nodded. So the trophy of the chase was drawn into a vacuum chamber in the prow, and surrounded for safety with absorption fields. No sooner had they completed this operation than Deuce announced another discovery. It spotted an object considerably smaller than the first, covered with a substance that absorbed radar waves. What gave it away was the spin resonance of the material. The thing was a squat cigar with a mass of some 5 tons. Again the orbiters went out, and after heating the insulation tore it from the gleaming metal of the spindle. Attempts to make the object react were fruitless. It was a corpse. A melted hole gaped in its side. The condition of the rim indicated that the hole was not very old. This prize, too, was put on board the ship. The hunting had gone well. Problems arose only in the examination and dissection of the double find. The first wreck, its 200-ton body resembling an enormous turtle, betrayed by its rough shell pitted from countless collisions with micrometeorites and dust, an age of probably 100 years, its orbit's aphelion went beyond the outermost globes of Zeta. The anatomy of the solidly armored turtle surprised the dissectors. The report was in 2 parts. In the first, Nakamura, Rotmont, and Al-Salam agreed in their description of the devices found inside the alien artifact. In the second part, however, their opinions as to the purpose of those devices differed widely. Polisar, who also participated in the examination, questioned the speculations of both physicists. The report, he said, was worth about as much as an account of an Egyptian pyramid by pygmies. Agreement on the building material told nothing about the structure's purpose. The old satellite possessed a peculiar power source. It contained piezoelectric batteries that were charged by a converter of a type the physicists had never seen before. The electric cells, compressed in a multi-cascade bank of purely mechanical pressure amplifiers, produced current while returning to position, impulses through a system of coils with phase impedance. But the cells could also give sudden and full discharges if the sensors in the hull short-circuited the reactance coils. In that case, the whole current, coursing through the tool spool drum, would explode it in a magnetic burst. Between the accumulators and the housing were empty bags or pockets filled with cinders. Into these ran glass-like tubes, the inside surface of a dull mirror. Perhaps they were eroded fiber optics. Nakamura's guess was that this wreck had at one time become overheated, which burned out some of its units and destroyed the sensors. But Rotmont thought that the destruction was caused not by heat, but rather catalytically, as if microparasites, non-living of course, had chewed through the satellite circuitry in the front section, and this long ago. The inside surface of the hull was covered with several layers of cells somewhat like a honeycomb except much smaller. Only by chromatography was it possible to identify in their ashes silico amino acids based on silicon, with double hydrogen bonds. It was here that the dissectors disagreed. Polisar thought these remains were of interior insulation for the hull. Kirsting, on the other hand, said they were from a system halfway between living tissue and non-living, the product of a technobiology of unknown origin and function. There were long heated arguments. The people of Hermes had before them evidence of the level of Quinton technology 100 years ago. Roughly speaking, the theoretical basis for this engineering could be compared to Earth's science at the end of the 20th century. At the same time, intuition, more than anything concrete, suggested that the basis direction of development of the alien physics had even then begun to deviate from the terrestrial. There could be neither synthetic virtuosology or technobiotics without first a grasp of quantum mechanics, but quantum mechanics immediately led to the fission and fusion of atomic nuclei. In that period, the best energy source for satellites or interstellar probes was the atomic micropile, and yet there is no trace of radioactivity in this old satellite. Could the Quintus have skipped the stage of explosive chain reactions and nucleonics and gone right to the next stage of the conversion of gravity into the quanta of strong interactions? But the piezoelectric battery contradicted that. The second satellite was worse yet. It had a battery of negative energy, the result of motion at near light velocity through the gravitational fields of large planets. Its pulse drive had been smashed by whatever had aimed and hit it. Perhaps a gigajoule shot of coherent light. It too showed no radioactivity. The internal struts were made from monomolecular carbon and bundles of fibers, no small accomplishment in solid-state engineering. In the uncrushed section behind the power chamber, they found cracked tubes with superconducting compounds that unfortunately ended right where the most interesting thing had been. As Palliser lamented, what could it have been? The physicists got into speculations that they would not have dared touch in more mundane circumstances. Perhaps the wreck contained a generator of unstable super-heavy nuclei, of anomalons. But for what purpose? If it was a robot laboratory for research, that would make sense, but was it? And why did the melted material behind the place of the hit resemble a kind of archaic induction coil, and the superconducting niobium alloys showed in the unbroken lengths cavities, parts eaten away by endothermic catalysts, as though some sort of erosion viruses had fed on the current, or rather on the superconductor itself. Even more curious were the small centers of destruction found in both satellites. These localized ravagings could not have been caused by any violent action from without. Most often, the compounds of the wires had been bitten through or gnawed at, producing tiny bead-like hollows. Rotmont, called in as a chemist, concluded that this was the work of highly active macromolecules. He was able to isolate a number of them. They had the shape of asynchronous crystals and preserved their selective aggressiveness. Some attacked only superconductors. He showed his colleagues under the electron microscope how the non-living parasites ate their way into the filaments of a superconducting niobium compound, multiplying as more and more material was devoured. He did not think that these viroids, as they called them, could have arisen spontaneously in the heart of the satellite. He assumed that the apparatus had been infected with IR viroids during its original assembly. For what reason? An experiment? But in that case, why send the satellites out into space? Then there was the notion of premeditated sabotage during the construction of the devices. According to such an idea, a conflict lay between these phenomena, the clash of opposing intentions. Some among the crew thought this conception smacked of anthropocentric chauvinism. Could not the problem have indeed been an ailment of the apparatus on the molecular level, something on the order of a cancer in non-living mechanisms that had a subtle and complex microstructure? The logician chemist ruled out this possibility for the first older satellite, the Turtle, which they had called the Moth during the chase. For the second, however, he could not rule it out with the same certainty. Although they did not understand the purpose for which both space vehicles had been constructed, the progress in engineering that had taken place over the time between the building of the first and the second was striking. Notwithstanding, the erosion viruses had found vulnerable places to feed in both satellites. Once on the trail of this idea, Rotmont could not and did not want to abandon it. The microelectronic examination of the samples taken from both captured devices proceeded rapidly, since the analyzer running it was under Deuce's control. Without that high-speed assistance, even a year would not have sufficed for the necrohistology. The results indicated that certain components of both satellites had acquired a kind of resistance to the catalytic corrosion, and in a way so narrowly defined, so specific, that one could speak of an immunological reaction by analogy to living organisms and microbes. In their imagination formed the image of a micro-military struggle, a war conducted without soldiers, cannons, bombs, and where the secret weapon, extremely precise, was a semi-crystalline pseudo-enzyme. As sometimes happened in a stubbornly pursued investigation, the total sense of the discoveries made, instead of simplifying, actually became more and more complicated as the work progressed. The physicists Rotmont and Kirsting now practically never left the ship's main laboratory. On non-living culture dishes, dozens of varieties of defense and attack compounds multiplied. At the same time, the line between what constituted an integral part of the alien machinery and what had invaded it to destroy it grew fuzzy. Kirsting observed that in general no such line existed in any strictly objective sense. Suppose that there arrived on Earth an extremely wise supercomputer, which knew nothing about the phenomena of life because its electronic forebears had long ago forgotten that they had been built by biological beings. It saw and studied a man who had 1. A cold, 2. Colon bacilli in his intestines. Was the presence of viruses in the nose of the man his integral, natural property, or not? Suppose the man, in the course of being examined, fell and acquired a lump in the head. The lump was a hematoma beneath the skin. The vessel suffered damage, but the lump could also be considered a kind of shock absorber created to protect the cranium from the next blow. Was such an interpretation impossible? It seemed comical to us, but this was not a joke. It concerned the whole scientific approach to the non-human. Steergard listened to the experts' arguments, merely nodded, and gave them an additional 5 days for research. It was a heavenly dispensation. For the last half-century, the technobiotics of Earth had taken a completely different path. Necroevolution had been deemed unprofitable. There had been no conjecture even about any sort of eventual machine speciation, but no one could say for sure that such a thing had not taken place on Quinta. All the captain asked was finally, was the hypothesis of conflict between Quintan builders a premise on which future decisions of the reconnaissance had to be based? But presenting the analyses that they had made, the experts did not want to speak of anything so definite as a premise. There was nothing certain in their hypothesizing. There were no facts. They knew enough now to appreciate how shaky they were the initial assumptions upon which their knowledge rested. An additional misfortune was the absence, in the younger wreck too, of communication systems even slightly similar to what could be derived from the theory of finite automata and information theory. Had the viroids devoured such pseudo-nerve networks totally? Even so, traces should have remained, vestiges. Possibly they did remain, but the people were not able to recognize them. From a transistor radio or pocket calculator dropped under a steamroller, could one deduce Maxwell's theory or Shannon's? The final council took place in an atmosphere of unusual tension. Stiergard gave up trying to elicit positive statements. He asked only if there was any evidence at all that the Quintons had mastered sidereal engineering. He considered this the most important question. If anyone guessed why the captain insisted on the point, he said nothing. So the Hermes drifted in darkness, and the men lost their way in a thicket of unknowns. The pilots, Harak and Temp, listened to the proceedings in silence. Nor did the doctor speak. Arago had put aside his monk's garb, and in the conversation it somehow happened that they were sitting, the four of them, in the upper level above the control room. Not once referred to his earlier words. And what if evil reigns here? When Gerbert observed that the expectations always fell short of the reality, Arago disagreed. Consider, he argued, the many obstacles we had to overcome, obstacles that our ancestors, even in the 20th century, had believed insurmountable. Consider how smoothly the voyage had gone. We had crossed light years without casualties, the Eurydice had entered Hades unerringly, and we ourselves had penetrated the heart of the constellation Harpy, and only days or hours now separated us from the inhabited planet. But you're giving us good therapy, Father, said Gerbert, laughing. He was the only one who still addressed the Dominican that way. He had difficulty dropping the "Father." It's the truth, nothing more. I can't tell you what will become of us. Such ignorance is our natural state. I know what you're thinking, Father, Gerbert said on impulse, that the Creator didn't wish there to be such expeditions, such meetings, such intercourse between civilizations, and therefore separated them with vast space. Yet here we have not only made a pie out of the apple of Eden, but we are now sawing down the very tree of knowledge. If you want to know my thoughts, I am at your service. I believe that the Creator limited us in nothing. In nothing. Meanwhile, it is unknown that what will grow from the grafts on the tree of knowledge. The pilots did not hear the rest of the theological discussion because the captain summoned them. He had set course for Quinta. After presenting the navigational trajectory, he added, "There's an attitude on board I hadn't expected. Imaginations are running a little wild, as you know. There's constant talk about enigmatic conflicts, microweapons, nanoballistics, war. This, I think, is the ballast of preconceptions. If we start trembling from the dissection of a couple of wrecked satellites, we soon won't be able to function. Every move we make will seem insanely reckless. I said this to the scientists, and I'm telling you too. Now, full speed ahead to Septima. You can use Deuce to hold the course. Then I want you at the wheel. Set up the ships between you any way you like." The ship's drive went on, and gravity, though weak, returned. Harak went with Temp to get the old science fiction book taken from the Eurydice. When they parted at the cabin door, Harak, much taller, leaned over as if to divulge a secret and said, Ter Harab knew who he was putting on the Hermes. "Did you ever see better men?" "Maybe, once. Not better. Men like himself." We now have nine chapters left. It says we're 50% through the book. So I could actually stop here for a little while and come back in a few hours. Um, Like my throat is starting to become itchy. So I think I should probably stop just for a few hours. I think I'll rest a little bit. And then hopefully part three um, will be able to wrap up this book in the next stream. But I'm thinking I should rest. Thank you for listening so far. Goodbye for now.